Hello, my name is Julie Tonneson and I am the Budget Director for the University of Minnesota. My task today is to walk through the basics of the university's budget at a high summary level. As you may know, the university is a research and land-grant institution encompassing multiple colleges and research centers located on 5 campuses and multiple research and outreach sites throughout the state. The budget I will be describing today is for the entirety of that activity, the whole institution. In this presentation, I will walk through the various revenue sources that support university activities with a bit of information on how they interact, and I will provide an overview of what the university spends those resources on in any given year. First, a bit of information about the overall size of the budget. For the fiscal year we are currently in, FY21, which runs from July 1, 2020 to June 30, 2021, we have estimated total revenues to be $3.9 billion. In addition to that, we operate a number of units that sell services to other university departments. That $240 million of internal sales activity just moves resources around the institution, so it is eliminated from the financial statements and the rest of this presentation. Before we get to a breakdown of the $3.9 billion of externally generated revenues, I should take a moment to explain that not all of our revenues are treated the same. Not all money is green at the university. We are required to do what is called fund accounting, which practically means that we keep track of our revenues based on where or who they come from and what their purpose is. Some of our revenues, identified here under the restricted heading and represented by the color red, are paid to the university for very specific purposes. The use of those dollars is directed by the entity providing the funds. As examples, when the federal government or any other organization provides funds to the university for research in a specific area, those funds cannot be used for any other purpose. When a donor provides funds for scholarships, those funds must be used for scholarships and nothing else. There is no ability for the university to redirect any of these restricted resources to any purpose other than that dictated by the source. A second set of revenues are what we call self-supporting or auxiliary dollars, coded in yellow in many of our charts. These are generated by units that operate as businesses. They largely exist by selling a product to an individual or organization external to the university. Major examples here include student housing and dining, parking, bookstores, and athletics on the Twin Cities campus. These activities are expected to set rates and collect revenue necessary to break even, to cover their direct costs and a portion of associated university overhead. For example, to meet the goals of holding down the cost of attendance for students, the university maintains student housing and dining rates at levels competitive with peer institutions. We do not charge rates designed to help cover costs in other parts of the university. Finally, from a budgeting perspective, the most flexible revenues we work with are unrestricted and represented as green. Within this category, the two largest and most flexible sources are the State Operations and Maintenance Appropriation, known as O&M, and tuition. These sources can be used across the institution to address critical needs, whether they be related to academic programs, student services, facilities, technology, compliance requirements, and so forth. These are the greenest dollars we have. Also in the unrestricted category are funds generated at the department level based on activities that they are uniquely engaged in. For example, we have units that operate clinics, like the Veterinary Medical Center or the School of Dentistry, that bill insurance companies or patients. And we have units that sell miscellaneous services to the public, like short courses through Minnesota Extension and so forth. These revenues are very helpful to the units that generate them, but they are rarely used by the university to solve budget challenges across units. So they are technically unrestricted, but a bit less, quote, green, if you will, than the state O&M appropriation and tuition. Now, the breakdown of revenues across the entire university budget is depicted on this pie chart. For the current year, just 41% of university revenues are from the state O&M appropriation and tuition, and thus available to address all kinds of needs across our missions of instruction, research, and outreach. An additional 14% is unrestricted at the unit level, as I described on the previous slide. 9% comes from the businesses within the institution to cover their costs. And finally, 36% of our revenues are restricted by the provider. We distinguish between the two red pieces of the pie because one section is even more restricted than the other. The darker red portion associated with sponsored funds is even more restricted than the lighter red sources because sponsors are involved in approving line item spending decisions. They not only provide the funds for a specific research project, for example, but they also dictate how much of the funding should be spent on salaries versus equipment versus travel and so forth. Again, not all dollars are equal from a budgeting perspective. To quickly provide a bit more information on two of the very important revenue sources we have, the state appropriation and tuition. For this year, the combined total of state appropriation and tuition, after factoring out tuition waivers granted to some students, is almost $1.7 billion. Within that total, tuition makes up the majority at 58%, and the state appropriation, including O&M and the restricted state specials, is the remaining 42%. Focusing on the state appropriation, it is helpful to think about it in three primary buckets. At the top of this slide, you see the FY20 and FY21 amounts for the O&M appropriation. At just over $600 million per year, that piece of the pie is in essence an unrestricted block grant. In the section just under that, you see the 5 appropriations called state specials. The dollar amounts are identified in law for the purposes that you see listed here. The university must allocate those amounts according to the direction provided in state law. Note that these two sections, the O&M appropriation and the state specials, are from the general fund of the state, largely supported by state income and sales tax proceeds. For purposes of this slide, I included only the recurring state specials that are included in our ongoing base appropriation. Finally, the bottom section identifies operating appropriations to the university from non-general fund sources. Both the $2,157,000 from the Healthcare Access Fund and the $22,250,000 annually from cigarette tax proceeds are restricted and must be directed to the health science-focused units of the university. Over time, the portion of the state general fund appropriated to higher education has declined, as this slide shows. This situation is not unique to Minnesota. It has been happening across the country. 30 years ago, higher education, the university, the Minnesota State System, and the Office of Higher Education received roughly 14.5% of state general fund appropriations. Today, higher education receives just under 7%. The university specifically has declined from 6.8% of the general fund appropriations to 2.7%. That decline in state support clearly shows as a shift in the university's overall budget over time. While the dark maroon bar on this graph represents the state appropriation has declined from 39% of the university's total revenues roughly 30 years ago to 17% today, the other revenue sources have thus increased as a portion of total revenues. Through rate increases and enrollment growth combined, tuition has increased as a percent of the university's budget from 12% to 25%. And the other types of revenue that I explained earlier in the presentation have grown from 49% to 58% of overall university revenues. It is actually very difficult to grow those other revenues generated from our businesses and our academic activity, but the university has done a good job in diversifying our revenues, which has served to decrease risk and has allowed us to maintain or enhance more of our programming than would otherwise have been the case. For a bit more information on those quote revenues, this graph categorizes them into 7 groups. I won't go into detail on what each group is, as some were explained earlier or are self-explanatory. Clearly, the largest group is sponsored resources. Those are the dollars provided by the federal government, state and local governments, foundations, business and industry, etc., in exchange for research findings or specified public service outcomes. Again, the color coding here indicates which are restricted in red, which are the self-supporting businesses in yellow, and which are unrestricted at the unit level, those in green. We have incentives within our budgeting process and model for units to grow these revenues to support their priorities as appropriate, but each comes with its own management nuance. For example, the sponsored funding I just mentioned does not cover the fully allocated costs of doing the research or public service work, so the university has to use other sources to pick up the remaining associated overhead. Or, as I mentioned previously, gifts can be unrestricted, but the truth is that 98% of gifts to the university are highly restricted by the donor, so the funds may be little help to some budget needs. All of these sources are important in the overall mix of the budget, but they hold unique characteristics and can raise challenges from a budgeting perspective. And those challenges carry through down to the unit level within the university. As the last focus on revenues, this slide identifies the Twin Cities colleges and major academic units and the system campuses and graphs their total revenues as received in FY20. From this chart, we can learn several things. First, there is a large difference in budgetary size of these mission-focused units, going from the smallest with a budget of $13 million to the largest with a budget of $761 million. We can also see that every one of these units receives state appropriation as a part of their budget, as indicated by the lime green portion of the bars. It makes up different proportions of each unit's budget. It's not allocated formulaically, but none of these units operates today without state support. And finally, we can see that the mix of revenues available to the units and their dependency on each source varies. Units such as the medical school, the College of Science and Engineering, and the School of Public Health are highly dependent on sponsored grants and other contracts as depicted in the dark blue, while other units such as the Duluth campus, the College of Liberal Arts, and the Carlson School of Management on the Twin Cities campus are highly dependent on tuition. The variance you see across units reflects their different levels of mission focus, teaching versus research, for example, and it impacts how they manage their budgets. When we develop the university overall budget, we start at this level, reviewing and understanding the different challenges and options available for each unit, and then we make decisions within that context to ensure each unit is as successful as possible, while also ensuring that the total budget, when you add it all up, balances every year. Finally, I will wrap up with just a few words about expenditures. The university keeps track of and reports on expenditures in two ways, as represented by the two pie charts on this slide. Because many of our sponsored grants are multi-year and are not budgeted on an annual fiscal year basis, this graphic excludes that activity. So the pie chart on the left side of this slide displays total projected non-sponsored expenditures in what we call object categories, typical spending types. As you can see, because education is a very people-driven industry, 62% of the total is spent on salaries and fringe benefits for our employees, which has been very consistent over the years. The remaining 38% is then distributed across a variety of other spending categories, the largest two being student aid and general supplies and services. The same $3.4 billion in projected total spending is displayed in the pie chart on the right in functional categories rather than object categories. As you can see, instruction is the largest functional spending category, followed by academic support and research. Keep in mind this total excludes the bulk of our research spending, which occurs in the sponsored funds, but there is still a significant amount of research activity funded by non-sponsored sources that appears here. Finally, even though the growth in cost for many of the items the university spends on exceeds the rate of inflation on a regular basis, you can see examples listed in the bullets on this slide. And even though our revenues generally grow every year, with new expectations for program enhancement, research expansion, and so forth, we have worked very hard to keep overall spending growth down. While in some years we may spend more on large pieces of equipment or large facility improvements, the bulk of the operating expenditures have been growing in the 1% to 2% range. This is accomplished through a process of continuous internal reallocation, reducing spending in one area in order to address higher priorities in another area. I have not clouded this presentation with information on how the global pandemic has impacted the university's budget because the basics of the budget remain the same. I will close, however, by just noting that for the end of FY20, all of FY21, and who knows how long into the future, our trend lines on revenues and expenditures will likely forever be altered by what we are experiencing. We're working to address all the challenges we face in a way that secures the long-term financial health of the university so we can remain a very strong partner in making Minnesota a great place to live and work. And with that, I thank you for your attention and the opportunity to explain this piece of the university. Have a great day.